Cool. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for having me.
Totally. No, it's always a nice little bonus to do it like this because I watch a lot more movies than TV, so it's kind of counted as cheating for me. So felt really
Uh,
good about it. Uh, and also it's kind of fun, I think, to talk about it now. Not that the film didn't hit when it did, because it really did sort of land in a really satisfying way. But for you as a filmmaker, I think it's also interesting because the thing you seem to do really well is hitting right now. I mean, you've floated around a lot of video game adaptations, like you do well with property. And I think
mhm.
people are starting to come around to like, that seems like a viable idea. Let's like let people do that. So I think not that it matters, but like I don't think you were ever wrong with your projects. You were just early.
Yeah. I mean, uh, in general, I'm actually attracted to a thing that someone would think on the outset is not a good idea.
Okay.
That someone would, or something that people would regard as silly.
Yeah.
I think there's always a way in. I think um, the thing that kind of launched me into a career of making movies was a short film based on a video game called Portal.
Exactly.
And at the time, that was viewed as not the video game property that people would want to adapt into a movie. It's a puzzle game, right? It's inherently uncinematic, and that was the fun of that, was to take that concept and say, no, this can be a movie, much like Christopher Nolan did with Batman. The Batman before was very comic booky, very silly, and he said, not that people couldn't see it as a movie, right? The Bat Nibbles, but that people, when they if they thought of it as a movie, they thought of it tonally very different than what he said. He said, take it seriously. This is cool and meaningful.
Yeah.
And that's been the thing for me too, is what is out there that I could say, you know what? I know that people have been seeing it one way, but there's another way to look at it, and it actually could be as meaningful as it is thrilling.
Yeah. Well, I think you navigate this really fine line really well with, I think, Cloverfield and this is, there's an audience that when they like something, they immediately want more, right? I want another Cloverfield. I want another Predator. And it better be different, but also has to be exactly the same thing I liked. Otherwise, I'm mad at you. And the fact that both times you really did satisfy people while still telling a different story is, I don't know that you get enough credit for that because that's really fucking hard.
I appreciate you saying it and saying it in that way. That is cool, to think about it, that that's how it's landing. And I definitely, um, on the one hand, I am a fan,
Yeah.
and I always say, like, we already have the thing that you like. I
Oh,
can watch that as many times as I want. So why not entertain the idea of having it play out a different way,
yeah.
so that we can also have that. But always, because I'm not cynical about the thing that I'm making, maybe at the heart of it is something that feels very authentic to the source material, to the IP, to
Sure.
the whatever. I mean, for Prey in particular, as different as it is remarkably similar. It really does follow a lot of the format set forth by the original film. And yet there's so much of it that you might feel like doesn't resemble the original at all. So that's always interesting to dive into and embrace both the similarities and the differences.
I really like the that a lot of people, myself included, right after it came out, we're having that conversation like, well, where else in history are you going to make a Predator? Because clearly, like almost any time period, you could have someone going up against the Predator because it's so deceptively simple. Like, well, what if there's just not really technology? All right, it's a, I think it's the interesting challenge for you more so than anything else is as you're writing it, you can't just be like, and then Arnold gets out a giant gun and now we're even. It's a lot of outsmarting a hunter.
Well, to be fair, once again, in following the heart of the source material, or the original, that isn't what happens in the original. That
Exactly.
that
Big guns
it
don't
starts
work.
out with the big gun, and then he learns the lesson that
Exactly.
we start out with. But but actually, to your even more pointedly to your question, even to the sentiment of what you're saying, it wasn't we never wanted to rely on just that premise being what's compelling. Like, oh, Predator new time period, let's see how it goes. We found a period in time and a certain character in that time in which having it be a Predator story, meaning an alien creature looking for the alpha, looking for the strongest thing, and its adversary being a character that's trying to prove to others and to herself that she is worthy, made the Predator movie more interesting and made her movie more interesting. You know what I mean? It wasn't just like, oh, random stories set in this time period that we, it was like, how does this feel like you'd make this movie even if there was no Predator in it? Or you couldn't, and then also simultaneously, you could not make it not a Predator movie. Like it's an essential Predator movie. So that was the challenge, and hopefully what it sounds like from your sentiment, it's like that's also the takeaway.
Oh, totally. I think
Yeah.
as you watch it, you have this like kind of dueling sentiment of, oh, it's obvious this is where it should be set, and also the idea of like it's sort of really wild that it's set there because it can be kind like I said, kind of can be said anywhere if you do it right, but also there's something about
Yeah.
this particular time period with this particular character that you're like you said, just you're so invested in the story that you're not checking your watch. You're not waiting for like, well, when's it going to show up? Like, it's got to start like doing stuff. Like there's a great release, obviously, with like French trappers. Where you're like, I know what you want, but everything surrounding it is so compelling that it's not a matter of like, well, this movie sucked until that. It's this movie's awesome, and then this awesome other thing happened. And how do you know you've got the right story? Because until you watch it, until other people tell you, you never know for sure. But how do you know to like want to spend the time doing it?
Thank you for saying that. I mean, I'm so glad that that's how you felt about it. I you know, I mean, you show it. I mean, first we trust our instincts. It's so tricky with genre. I know this isn't exactly what you're asking, but since I've done a number of like thriller horror-y things,
Yeah.
I've realized that it's an especially challenging genre because it's not scary when you're reading it. It's not scary when you're making it. It's not scary when you're editing it. Like you really have to rely on your craft, on like the way you compose frames, the timing of the edit, all of those things. As you hone your skill, it's like, okay, I think this is going to affect people in a certain way. And it's not until an audience watches it, an audience of friends and family, in our case, or peers or whatever, to tell us as we're working on it, and sometimes general audiences, like, oh, okay, it does work. We did do the right thing. So, and I think that the story we're telling, aside from the genre aspects, the story we're telling and the character that we're focusing on is so much more universally relatable than lots of films, and certainly Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Arnold represented wish fulfillment, and not Amber and Nadu represents like how all of us probably feel inside. So
Oh yeah, they're sort of in concert with each other because you have some of the biggest human beings to ever walk the planet, as opposed to someone who much more realistically looks like you, better version of me, but like looks more like you. And to what
yeah.
you're saying, it is wild to think of how much you have to trust your instincts in the same way that an actor has to trust you. They're gonna stand there, and whether it's green screen, whether it's like you said, John Goodman doing awful things in Cloverfield, like he doesn't know it's gonna translate. He has to look over and you go, "That's not dumb, right? It's gonna work." And you have to think, "Yeah, no, totally." And in your head, you're like, "I hope so. We're gonna find out when I go sit down." I think I would imagine when it's going well, and both of these films clearly turned out well, that you have a feeling. There's some sort of like North Star where you're like, I think what we're doing is hitting. Like something's telling me, as opposed to like the creeping self doubt of like, I don't know, we might have just wasted a day. Like nothing happened today.
Well, it's a little bit of both,
Yeah, that
to be
happens.
honest. I
Yeah.
definitely have had. I actually remember specifically right after Cloverfield Lane, I did an episode of Black Mirror, and I was editing it at the same time that another director was editing his episode.
Yeah.
And I walked by his edit bay, and I looked in, and I was crushed. I was like, oh my God, his looks like a real movie. Ours just looks like our dailies. Like his. And then he came in our room later, and he looks in, and he goes, "Oh, Russia's envy." Like,
Yeah.
what do you? He's like, "Oh, yours looks so much better than mine," or whatever. Like, right? It's so hard when you're watching something to not feel like this is just what I saw in my head. Like that's all. And sometimes it does take some perspective to get. I've definitely had days while shooting where I'm like, oh dear God, I don't know. And I luckily have collaborators that are like, no, 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 this is good, keep going. Or like, yeah, you're right, let's abandon ship. Let's do. There's lots of. I remember there's a whole half a morning of coverage on Cloverfield Lane that afterwards I was like, that was the wrong set. We should have shot it from a different, and we did. We just redid it. And then you do. There are times where you have that little Jiminy Cricket that's like, this is good, keep going, this is good,
Well, you
that
probably
you
have
come to
to.
rely on.
Yeah, you probably have
Yeah.
to remember that like not everyone else can see what you're seeing because you know what's behind the camera. You're like, okay, this looks great, but I know behind the camera is just nonsense. Like it's just like wood and walls, and everyone can't see that. So they're immersed. I'm never gonna be, but other people will be, and I just have to trust that it's gonna translate. And is like the opening a time to like breathe? Because like you said, you kind of never know until you start to get people to tell you, okay, you were right, or like you better get a new job. Like when people start reporting like, hey, I liked it, or when you start seeing people like pay to see it, can you kind of like relax and go like, all right, I got a job still?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There used to be a period of time. This is a long time ago, shooting on film, when the film would, at least for me, send the film in to get developed, and then you'd have it transferred and start cutting.
Sure.
And in that magical period of time, you couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And that was my most relaxed. I'm like, at this moment, I could be a genius. Like that footage is going to come back and it looks amazing. Or it's going to fall the other way, but I have no control over it at that moment.
I did it.
So we don't have that anymore, but I I definitely you don't feel that way for a long time while you're cutting it. You do worry that you're crazy. And yes, the release, the positive reaction, it starts to build a little bit when people are seeing it earlier or whatever. But I remember when Prey came out, we went, well, me and Amber and some other cast and crew, we went to Disneyland.
Nice.
So I didn't really check my phone the entire day, and really just sort of enjoyed our time. And then when I got in the car on the ride home, I opened up Twitter and I saw Barry Jenkins was like live tweeting
Yeah.
his experience watching the movie, and I was like, oh my, like that was enough. I was
Yeah.
totally, relieved. So yeah, it was awesome.
I can imagine it's also easier to talk about it now. It's been enough time that you're thinking
Mm,
about other projects, so you're thinking about it as a thing you already did, as opposed to a thing you're making. I imagine like opening week when you're doing like press and that sense, you're like, I kind of want to talk about anything else. Like,
yeah. But worse actually is when you're doing not junket, behind the scenes interviews
yeah,
while you're making it, and you're still in the weeds. Like
yeah,
and you have to speak with authority about what the is, but what you're feeling inside is, I don't know what I think I have a plan. I don't want to say something now, and then it turns out in the edit, like, oh, it's not that at all, and so that's the worst when it's coming out. You kind of have a sense by then of like what we've accomplished, for better or for worse. But yeah.
yeah. And I think at this point, because you've done, I think both of the features are based on other properties, but very much becoming your own thing. And the episodes of TV have been like, I'm picking up where someone else has had an idea, but I'm able to put my stamp on it. Like that's kind of become, I don't know if a comfort zone is the right word because you never, anything could be a terrible or a great project when you start, but it seems like there's an ability to step in and go, I'm not going to screw up what you have, but I have an idea and I think the idea will work. And I also think it's a good enough idea that someone else can then pick it up and go, I have an idea. And both of the films,
Mm,
especially, I think are that way. Like there could easily be follow-ups that you're not involved in that work completely because they leave on these really satisfying yet open-ended notes, and that's also really hard to do.
mm. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate you saying, and yeah, I definitely enjoy an ending that feels complete.
Sure.
So it doesn't feel like this just existed for another movie to happen.
Yeah.
And yet, so it feels complete, but still there's enough propulsion in that last. Both movies sort of end with a character that's like reinvigorated themselves.
Yeah, yeah, like, bring it on. I'm ready
So
for more.
certainly one could think, oh wow, I could see another movie like that. Or what a poetic, beautiful way to end that story. Before we had T2, when we just had Terminator, that movie ended both with a character going through an insane gauntlet and coming out the other side and much uh, and yet the future was uncertain for them, and that was an okay place to end a movie until we saw T2, and then it was like, oh no, of course that was just part one of what was the obvious part, part one and two, and um,
Yeah, when it goes right, like these cases, yeah, you have that feeling of like, if I never see more, great place to leave off, and I'm confident in their abilities. And if it does continue, you're like, well, of course I get to see more because they're like they're now fully formed. So I want to see the fully formed adventure. It's kind of what I think like comic books used to be. It's serialized storytelling. Like if they just
yeah,
stopped, nobody went, oh no. But when they made another one, you're like, well, of course Spider-Man keeps going. Like it's just there's never going to be an end.
right,
Boy, how right they were.
yeah.
As we
Totally,
as we
yeah.
sort of wrap up, is there a property that like if somebody just said like we'll write the check that you would want to tackle? Because these have kind of come out organically. But if there was something to pursue, was there ever a thing that you're like, well, if I could do this, because I feel like you could do almost anything at this point.
um there's definitely been things like that over the years. The interesting thing is they keep changing,
Yeah.
because I would have said at one point um, something when I was 10 years ago, that now my taste, either then they've made the movie, someone else has made that movie, or my tastes have changed, and it's like, oh, that's a movie I would have loved to make 10 years ago. That's not quite where I'm at now, and how, the way I, what I feel like I need to get out of me now. So it's constantly evolving. But you know, I'm trying very hard to smuggle really interesting ideas into well-established franchises, or very original ideas. Those have been harder. Those have been a little harder to push up the mountain, and I continue to push those boulders up the mountain. So
Hopefully getting easier every time. So
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
looking forward to it because I think I truly
awesome.
think like in terms of I don't know who can do this. Give this to someone. Like I think you should be a name that's on a lot of like the people who make decisions list because the proof is in like two films that are very easily, I would say already Prey has like stood the test of time. Those it's so easy to be a disposable piece of entertainment now. Like comes for a week, makes some money, and then nobody talks about it. And the fact that even though it's an Emmy push, it's a slightly different quirk. The fact that people want to talk about it and want to be like, oh yeah, I want to like, and we'll revisit it, says something, as opposed
Mm,
to, oh yeah, I remember watching that movie, and then just kind of like move on. I think people don't want to move on because they appreciate it, and that's hard to pull off.
mm. Interestingly put, man. And that's yeah, thank you. I'm glad people are still talking about it. I hope people continue to talk about it and revisit it. And I look forward to more.
Totally.
Yeah.
I look forward to the
Yeah.
next one. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. This is
Thanks, man.
no, totally my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very cool.